In marriages marked by abuse or betrayal, family researchers have been shocked to see that devout people of faith hang on longer than most people, trying harder through prayer, fasting, pastoral advice, and self-blame. They cling to their church's promises that God will heal their marriage. They beg for a miracle, but little or nothing improves over time. Today, we are talking about abuse, betrayal, moral injury, and how to heal and move on. I'm Gretchen Baskerville, and I'm a Christian divorce recovery leader. Nearly 30 years ago, I began co-leading divorce recovery groups in my very conservative church. And now, online. Nearly everyone in my private Facebook group, the Life Saving Divorce Private Group, has experienced the spiritual anguish and confusion of being betrayed by someone who should have loved and cared for us, whether a parent, a spouse, a pastor, or a church leader. And I am so excited to interview Rachel Kanter today. Back in March, I was doing some research on moral injury and domestic violence, and I stumbled across her new research article that she had just published the month before. She wrote it on moral injury and interpersonal violence. Moral injury is the technical term for what we religious and spiritual people go through when we experience this. Now, let me read you her biography. Rachel Kanter is a researcher specializing in moral injury, particularly in the context of interpersonal violence, and how facets of religiosity and spirituality influence post-traumatic outcomes. Her research has been published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence and the Journal of Religion and Health, and she has presented at numerous national conferences, including the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. She's a student at California State University, San Bernardino, and an intern at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. Rachel plans to pursue doctoral training in clinical psychology with the long-term goal of informing evidence-based interventions for individuals experiencing moral and spiritual distress. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Gretchen. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Tell us first how you got interested in this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this question because I think it's really interesting. So we'll get into this a little bit later in the conversation, but moral injury has this very military focused background. So most of the research conducted on moral injury has been conducted among military populations and in military context. And I think that my introduction to it was separate from any history or knowledge of that history of the development of moral injury at all. So when I first learned about the construct, I was actually researching faculty members' research interests. And I found a faculty member and it said on her interest that she was interested in moral injury. And I was like, I have to know what this is. The term itself was so compelling. What is a moral injury? And when I read the common outcomes, the symptoms of moral injury, the description of it, I didn't think immediately of military service members. I thought of the survivors of childhood sexual abuse whom I knew, the survivors of intimate partner violence whom I knew, and everything about the construct, the way that it was described, outcomes of it, the symptoms of it, reminded me of so many conversations I'd had with these survivors throughout the years. And then when I went to look into, well, has anyone researched moral injury among survivors of abuse in interpersonal violence contexts? And there really was nothing at the time. There was maybe one article at the time, and it was among a sample of 80 women, and there just wasn't a lot of research available. And so because of my background with knowing so many survivors of abuse, unfortunately, but fortunate to know these great people, I just saw this as a gap that I could help fill. And so that's how my sort of research journey into this topic began.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, once you've heard enough stories, when you hear about moral injury, and I did a little dive into it back in March, I was like, wow, I identify with this.
Mhm.
Everybody in my group identifies with this. Okay,
Mhm.
so how do you define moral injury? And how was it first applied in these military situations? And then how does it apply now? How is it adapted to survivors of intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the sort of definition, and I will say that it's developed quite a bit over time, like all mental health constructs. It first gets discovered, people think that it's one thing and maybe not another, and then it develops over time, right, as people do more research. And moral injury is no different. So I would say that it's generally referred to as the persistent or ongoing psychological, biological, social, and spiritual distress that can occur following one's experience of what's deemed a potentially morally injurious experience. And so there isn't a lot of consensus, for example, on what constitutes a potentially morally injurious experience, but people do report elevated distress following being betrayed by others, following betraying their own moral code, following being unable to prevent some harm from occurring to others. So because it's been applied in these sort of military contexts, there's a limited amount of information regarding how it applies specifically to survivors of interpersonal violence. I'll start, I think, with Dr. Jonathan Shea. So Dr. Jonathan Shea, he's the first person in modern history to call something a moral injury. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he has this book called Achilles in Vietnam. And he draws on his many decades of work with Vietnam War veterans. And he describes moral injury specifically as a betrayal of, quote, what's right by legitimate authority figures in high stakes contexts. Now, it's a very limited sort of sphere and definition of moral injury. And I think that that's very much influenced because of who he worked with. That was what he was seeing pop up in that exact population in Vietnam War veterans.
So, for example, he's talking about you're in Vietnam, your leader tells you spray all these huts with bullets, and you do, and you come to regret it. You come to realize the command was wrong. You following the command was wrong. You've done real injury. And then, in a horrible way, you've also injured yourself. Now you are struggling with, I've hurt other people.
Right.
What is my life worth now? What is my integrity worth now? And so there's a lot of questioning of who am I now, now that I've done this horrible thing, even though I did it at the time for what seemed like legitimate reasons. So, how does that work with domestic violence survivors?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can see that the definitions of moral injury have since expanded since Shea's original, so very specific definition of that. And Vanderweel and his colleagues just recently, I think last month, published this new paper on introducing a new assessment and definition of moral injury that really increases its capacity to affect survivors of interpersonal violence and in other cases. They describe moral injury as a persistent distress that arises from a personal experience that disrupts or threatens A, one's sense of the goodness of oneself, of others, of institution, or of what are understood to be higher powers, God, or one's beliefs or intuitions about right and wrong or good and evil. So we can see that from Shea's original conception, it's expanded quite a bit. And I now think with this new definition that a lot of researchers are going to start researching this construct in interpersonal violence populations because it allows it to be studied in these populations.
Every day I hear from people who say, I was being hit or belittled or demeaned, not just once or twice, but it had become a pattern in my marriage. I went to my pastor, and my pastor just swept it under the carpet. You
Yeah.
need to forgive and forget. You need to remember it always takes two to tango. So maybe there's something you're not doing quite right. And over time, they went back, the spotlight was turned on them. So they went home, they bent themselves over inside out trying to be the best spouse. And by the way, I have both men and women in my
Of
private
course.
group online. So they did everything they could to be the most exemplary spouse they could possibly be. And of course, doing all that doesn't stop an abuser from abusing. And so they'd go back to the pastor over and over, and the pastor would come up with a new thing like, well, you just need to apologize more, or you need to be more humble, or you need to do this or that. And by the way, divorce is out because God absolutely hates divorce. And so people start understanding that if I divorce to get myself and my children free from this abuse, then God is going to hate me. So now I have a God, a higher power, who is siding with the abuser. The higher power wants me to obey, even if I am completely debased, even if I am treated like dirt, even if I'm totally destroyed. This is what I have to do to please God. And this messes with their view of God. It messes with their view of the church. It messes with their view of their pastor, their Bible study leader, and their church friends. So, where do you go from here?
Yeah, well, I'm just so sorry to hear that people are experiencing this. It's so terrible. And it really reminds me of research that I've read on the effects of clergy perpetrated sexual abuse. So, for example, in studies that look at interviewing survivors of clergy perpetrated sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, those survivors describe immense injury to their religious and spiritual life. One man described having a panic attack anytime he passed by a church because of
Oh,
what he experienced. One woman said that they stole her religion from her. And it's because these abusers, it wasn't just the abuse, it was that they said, God told me I could do this. God said that this was okay. And so what you're describing there, I think just evokes that these pastors unfortunately are doing so much harm, and they're causing these survivors not just to feel betrayed by the church and by the pastor, but because they're mixing up, they're saying this is what God wants for you to do. If you divorce, God isn't going to like you anymore, essentially, or you've disappointed God in this way. They're damaging that person's relationship to God. And something to note here as well, and this was done in a sample of military veterans, but I think it does apply here, is when researchers looked at co-occurring moral injury and struggles with religion and spirituality, they found that the group that was experiencing moral injury and struggles with their religion at the same time, had much higher levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, of depression, and so on, relative to those who were only experiencing moral injury or those who weren't experiencing either.
that's really shocking. You're basically saying, I hate to be this blunt, but someone with no strong religiosity, no strong faith, that they would go through moral injury. And yes, it would be traumatizing for them, but it would not be nearly as traumatizing if they also add to this stew of issues the fact that they're supposed to be following the Lord and doing what's right biblically. They're supposed to respect their pastor and want to please their pastor for sure, as well as God. And that actually makes the post-traumatic stress worse for people when they're experiencing abuse, not better. Although I imagine there are ways in which our faith makes it better. I know certainly on the other side, when we finally break free and file for divorce and finally get away and we get to safety, I do know that faith absolutely can help people rebuild their lives. In my group, I did a survey a couple years ago of do you still attend the church you attended before your divorce? And in my group, 40%, so 4 in 10, said, yeah, I got a lot of support from my church. I still attend that church. 30%, so 3 in 10, said, no, I've had to switch churches. I couldn't deal with the gossip. I couldn't deal with the judgment. I didn't want to sit alone in church with my children. It just felt too embarrassing. I was tired of sneaking into the back row after the service started. And then the last 3 in 10 said, I can't even darken the door of a church right now. The instant I hear a marriage sermon where they promise that my marriage will be great as long as I was a virgin when I married, and I prayed and I laid it on the table before the Lord, and I fasted and I did everything right, and I set aside lust, and I entered marriage with absolutely the purest of intentions that I would
Right.
have this amazing marriage with emotional intimacy and mind-blowing sex.
Mm.
And I didn't get that. I got not even close to that. I got the far opposite. And that's what I hear in my group.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense based on what I know of the research on this topic. So, for example, research does really consistently find that leaning on God, turning to God, and one's personal relationship with God can be so helpful, not just in terms of recovery from trauma, but also in leaving an abusive relationship. So, survivors will often say, I turned to God. God gave me the strength to leave. I knew that God loved me and he didn't want me to be treated like this, and that's why I left. And so we see a lot of positive benefits if the survivor has this positive relationship with God, how they're able to use that to give themselves strength to leave and strengthen their recovery.
And it's not just a positive relationship with God, because I would argue that probably everybody in my group is in my group because they absolutely put God first in their life. Not everybody. I mean, the vast majority would say they had a very positive relationship with God. The problem was that they believed that obedience was the way they showed their devotion to God. But God's plan for marriage does not include chronic abuse or betrayal. God doesn't want his beloved sons and daughters to suffer at the hands of a spouse or anyone else who is abusing them. God is a rescuing God. Jesus came to set the captives free. So it has to do a little bit about how their church taught them that God sees domestic violence and marriage relationship problems.
Right. And I'm so glad you brought that up because I was about to say that as well. What we also find in the literature, what some might say, like a darker side to the role of religion in recovery from intimate partner violence, is that a lot of pastors and a lot of churches are just not responding appropriately and in some cases causing real harm. So, for example, there was a study that found that one survivor even mentioned that she had a protective order against her husband, and the pastor told this man where she was living.
Oh, no.
And I'm sure that you've heard much worse than that. So I think that unfortunately, the social aspect of religion, the people who are involved in religion, be it pastors or community members, your fellow churchgoers, are unfortunately just not knowledgeable about how to respond appropriately to survivors of intimate partner violence, or they have some sort of theological understanding that, like you mentioned, you can't divorce in any circumstance. I think when I was reading your book, I looked at, you had graphs in there about the percentage of pastors in what cases they thought divorce was acceptable or something of that nature. Maybe you can speak to this, but about 20% of pastors, I can't recall the exact number, who said that even in cases of abuse, it's not okay. And
Yeah.
I don't understand that at all. Have you found anything or do you know of anything as to why pastors are preaching this narrative? Why is this happening?
This is especially true in evangelical, some Reformed churches, and conservative parts of any Christian denomination. Right. The
Of
more
course.
conservative it is, the more they're going to be about rule following and control.
Right.
So there are 17 large evangelical and or Reformed denominations that do not condone, I should say. They don't have any way of allowing or not allowing,
Sure.
but do not condone in the United States divorce for either physical violence or emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse. Neither one of those is seen as being biblical in these churches. So if you attend one of these churches,
It doesn't matter how long you have attended. It doesn't matter how much you volunteered or tithed or loved the pastor or attended every week. And it doesn't even matter how much your pastor likes and admires and respects your faith. They will not let you out, and they will try to find reasons. I call it gaslighting, spiritual reasons why you must stay. But what it comes down to is that pastor does not want to be accused by fellow pastors in the denomination of being soft on divorce or opening the floodgates to divorce. And so that pastor is not going to be on your side and is not going to support your desire to divorce. And it's so tragic to see how many people have to leave those churches and sometimes leave their faith entirely in order to get to safety, both for themselves and for their children.
And I'm glad you brought that up. You brought up safety as well, because I wanted to touch on, in preparation of this interview, I was researching forgiveness a little bit. And I came across this blog post written by a professional counselor. And she talked about how you need to be safe before you forgive. And I thought that that was so important, because so many survivors are being told to forgive and to reconcile while the abuse is still ongoing. And it's just such an irresponsible way to talk to survivors. And it really, I think, points to how little education a lot of these people have, because from the research, people don't change. You forgiving people doesn't change them if they have to decide to change on their own. And so telling you to go back to an abusive spouse is just irresponsible. And I'm so sorry that someone ever said that to you or did that to you. I can't think of anything that's more irresponsible than that. It's really terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were taught, it's not just forgive, it's forgive and forget and reconcile, sweep
Mhm.
everything under the carpet, which takes away your voice. When the ancient Hebrew people, when evil had been done to them, they came together as a community to cry out to the Lord, to weep, to remember the evil that had been done to them, and then asking for God's deliverance. And so when we're told to forgive, forget, reconcile, sweep it under the carpet, we don't have that ability to get the communities care for us, those hugs, rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. We need those voices who say, that should never have happened to you. He, or in some cases, the man is the victim. She should never have done that to you. That's not normal husband or wife behavior. And that is taken away in churches that use forgiveness in the wrong way. We all believe in Jesus' teachings on forgiveness, but when it is used to coerce us to stay with a dangerous person or a person with a pattern of marriage endangering sins, then it hurts more than it helps.
Absolutely. And there's research on this. So there's a lot of good research noting the positive benefits of forgiveness, but those studies are done post trauma. You've
Mm.
left the abusive spouse, you're no longer being abused by that parent. And so forgiveness therapies are proven effective among those populations. But we have to note that those people are no longer in proximity to those people who abuse them. They are now in a place of safety. And there was this really interesting study, I don't know if you're familiar with it, by James McNulty. This was back in 2011. And he did this really interesting, what's called a longitudinal study, which just means it lasted for 4 years total. And he gave these couples surveys every year for 4 years. And he assessed their level of physical and emotional abuse perpetration every year, as well as how likely their partner was to forgive them. So partners reported whether or not their partner had been abusive to them, and also what their tendency to forgive them in various circumstances was. And what he found was really interesting. So I would say, contrary to maybe how a lot of churches would teach this, he found that when people's self-reported tendency to forgive their partner was high, the partner's behavior did not change at all.
Wow.
Did not change at all. And
Okay.
that just is in complete contradiction to so many saying, oh, if you just forgive your spouse, they'll become better. That is not what the research shows. And then a second thing that came out of that study that I think has really significant implications is that when the partner's self-reported forgiveness was lower, it was relatively high on average, but when it was lower than the high group, the partner got better over time.
Okay, I really want people to hear this. So, if you were quick to forgive, if you were that person who jumps in and apologizes even though you've done nothing wrong, this study found that the abuse continued. I got to be careful how I say this because I don't want to shame anyone
Of course.
who tried this and it didn't work, but you're saying that he found that people who were less likely to forgive, who are a little bit more holding their feet to the fire, saw better behavior from
Their
that.
partners, yeah, their partners got less abusive, less toxic over time. And I think what that points to, and this is not to shame survivors in the slightest. I mean, churches, society tells us that it's good to forgive people, to keep forgiving them over and over again. So you were hearing constant societal messaging that that's the right thing for you to do.
And
But
also, let's jump in here and say there are people who are so destructive, so abusive. This is so ingrained into their psyche, into their mentality, into who they are. It wouldn't matter if you didn't forgive at all. It wouldn't matter how
agreed.
angry you get, how much you walk away. They're going to continue because this is hardwired into them in one way or another. So I just want to caution you, not you, but the people
Right.
listening. If you say, "Oh no, if I had just been a little bit slower to forgive, he would have changed." No, that's not what we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter how good an example you set. It doesn't matter how much love of God is in your heart. You cannot fix the heart, the childhood trauma, or the behavior or the choices of that other person.
Right.
Setting a good example alone is not good enough. It doesn't do it. It's not the magical cure. They have to want to change, and many of them are motivated not to change, and there's nothing you can do about that.
Absolutely. And I think what we see here too is a consequence of what is a really good thing, which is people's empathy. So, what we find with so many survivors, what I don't want to say causes, what it is associated with people staying longer is people's self reported empathy. And so basically, what's happening is the survivor is saying, oh, well, he or she, they were abused when they were a kid. He or she, I can see how I might be this way if I had their situation too. And so there's this over empathizing with the perpetrator of the abuse. And what I like to point out here is they are not empathizing with you. They are
Wow.
not empathizing with you the way that you're empathizing with them. And your quality of being empathetic is so powerful. Let's use it on people who deserve it. Let's use it on
Right.
people who are as empathetic with you as you are empathetic with them.
Because abusers choose empathetic people.
Absolutely.
Abusers choose people who are rule followers, who are people who really want to do right in this world, who have tender consciences, who tend to point the finger at themselves and say, "What am I doing wrong?" Abusers pick people like us who are wonderful friends, wonderful parents, wonderful to those around us. And that's exactly the kind of people that abusers love to take advantage of.
Absolutely. The compassionate, the kind, the agreeable, the polite, those unfortunately are all risk factors for being taken advantage of in this way.
And we
And
don't want to change, by the way. We
no,
don't want to change. We like being loving, kind, caring people. But sadly, that puts us at risk. And we've got to get away from people who take advantage of that.
absolutely.
Invest our good traits into people who really appreciate it and have similar traits.
Yeah, absolutely. And from there, I think I'll maybe take it a little bit in a different direction to something I also wanted to talk about because I also saw this theme kind of emerge from the stories in your book that you shared. regarding friends, regarding people in the community, regarding these other people who are not your partner, but who may also be having a toxic effect on your life. There's this construct in social psychology called belief in a just world. And it's basically what it sounds like. It essentially means the extent to which you believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And what we find with this construct is that the more people believe in this, the more likely they are to blame victims. And that connection makes sense, right? Because that's a way of the psyche saying, okay, well, I see this bad thing is happening to you. You must have done something to cause it. And I really see that as like a self-protection mechanism on their part. Because if I am blaming you, the victim, and I don't want to believe that something like that could ever happen to me, then all I have to do is blame you. Because then I can say, oh, well, I would never do something like that. We see this all the time with, for example, survivors of rape, for example. Oh, well, what were you wearing? And so that way, that gives me the power as the person who's blaming the victim to say, oh, well, as long as I don't dress that way, then I will never be raped. And so it's the same thing if you are experiencing this, because I was just seeing this pop up in your book quite a lot with stories of survivors being blamed by pastors and pastors' wives, of their fellow religious community, of their friends, etc. And the betrayal that that must cause, because you know that you didn't do anything wrong.
Right,
Or
right.
maybe you start to doubt yourself because of the messaging that you keep hearing.
Yeah.
And what I want to say is that if someone responds to you in this way, it's probably because they have this belief that the world is just and that bad things only happen to you because you did something bad. It's an immature outlook. It's not the way the world works. We know, and we know this, right? Did every victim of the Holocaust do something bad to deserve that? I don't think any of us would say that. But for some reason, a lot of people just seem to believe that. And so that's something that I wanted to mention as well for any survivors who are maybe suffering from feeling betrayed by their friends or by their communities because of the way that they were responded to when they said, hey, I'm being abused, I'm not being treated right.
Yeah, you just hit that dead on, because what we call it in our world is the prosperity gospel. That if you attend church enough, if you give enough money, if you pray just the right way, if you say the right things in prayer, if you fast enough, if you're a virgin before you walk down that aisle, there's this implicit promise. It's never quite said that way, but it is a definitely unspoken promise that your marriage will be amazing. And when it isn't, you're right. They have to blame you. Well, keep looking for that sin that you must have committed that's causing your bad marriage. And so many of us had to stay in our terrible marriages for an incredibly long time, much longer than any secular person would have, because we were always wondering, is there a secret sin that I'm just not aware of? Lord, reveal to me that secret sin that has made my spouse commit so many marriage endangering, marriage destroying sins in our household. It is absolute moral injury for us. It is very, very painful, and it does a lot of damage to our trust in God, in institutions, and in our leaders, and some of it rightfully so.
Absolutely. And I think with that, maybe let's bring it back to moral injury, since we kind of skipped over that a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about the different subtypes of moral injury. So I mentioned that moral injury is this personal distress that arises from these experiences that severely transgress your beliefs about right and wrong. And so research kind of delineates between two specific subtypes or outcomes of moral injury. There's self-directed, sometimes called shame-related moral injury in the literature. And that essentially refers to the extent to which you blame yourself for the morally transgressive event, where you feel a loss of trust in yourself, where you maybe don't feel like you're a good person or you're a moral person anymore. And that's called self-directed moral injury. And then there's other directed moral injury, sometimes called trust and violation related moral injury. And that's the extent to which you feel that other people have transgressed your moral code. You've been betrayed in some respect. you've lost a sense of trust in humanity and in others. And those are two distinct subtypes. And what's interesting is that researchers, especially coming again from this military sort of context, have tended to say those are associated with the types of morally injurious experiences that occur, such that when you yourself perpetrate or fail to prevent some sort of morally injurious experience, so for example, shooting into the huts, for example, like you brought up earlier, then that causes self-directed moral injury. And then likewise, if you are told to shoot into the huts, you experience that betrayal by your leader who told you to do that. And now you experience other directed moral injury. But again, this is not taking into account how complicated survivors of abuse feel about these different situations. The lines between the agency that you feel about your role in morally injurious experiences are so severely crossed over because of the nature of the relationship between you and the perpetrator. Are you familiar with betrayal trauma or betrayal trauma theory?
Oh, yes, we talk about it a lot.
Okay, great. So I think that's where this comes in, right? This sort of betrayal blindness where that Freud talks about, where survivors, in order to maintain that attachment relationship to the perpetrator, take on the blame for the abuse that occurs. And so I think in cases of interpersonal violence, what I found in my own research and what I think research is going to continue to find is that survivors of abuse that is perpetrated by a romantic partner, a parent, or someone who's close to you is going to cause both types of moral injury because those lines are just blurred. You have no idea. You feel, at one sense, betrayed by this person who did this to you. This is someone who loved me, who betrayed me in this way by doing something so wrong to me, and by continually to do something wrong to me. But I also maybe feel like, is this my fault somehow? This is what we see with survivors of all types of interpersonal trauma. They want to find some sort of way to blame themselves for it. And I think part of that is some sort of underlying desire that it could be different somehow. You see this, for example, when people go through some sort of like traumatic death, when someone they love dies in some sort of very quick way, the mind will start to think, oh, well, maybe this could have happened. Maybe if I'd done this, then this would have happened. Maybe if I would have done this, the would have, could have, should have, right? And what the psyche is doing is trying to create some sort of alternate reality where that person didn't die, where that bad thing didn't happen to you. And so I think that's the underlying desire of self-blame, is trying to figure out some sort of way where it could have been different. But unfortunately, it could never have been different because you can't control the perpetrator.
What you said is just so powerful, because I'm thinking every week we have somebody in the group who says, I filed for divorce and it's amazing. My spouse has just turned into a different person. They are so kind and caring. And maybe I was just self-deceived. Maybe this is all a horrible mistake. Maybe they really have completely changed now. And I don't know that I want to go forward with the divorce. And so we have a lot of people who back out. And of course, usually they realize the change wasn't real. I was either exaggerating it in my own mind, or they were really working hard for a number of weeks, but then they stopped. And then they feel double blame. I got bamboozled. So now I can't trust myself because I can't even trust my own feelings, my own observations. Where they blame
Like a
themselves.
self-directed moral injury, yes. A loss of trust in oneself is a major symptom of self-directed moral injury.
Okay, so all these people who say, I don't even know if I could trust myself, and even when they're out, they say, I don't think I could ever trust myself to date again. So I'm just not going to date, which, is their choice, of course. But I hear it so often, and that really explains it for me. Thank you. You've opened a window on that thing.
Yeah, and this is unfortunately a very common reaction to being betrayed in this way, because you start to lose a sense of reality. And often so much gaslighting is going on. And I think that might even, I would imagine, compounded if you're also experiencing that sort of gaslighting by your religious institution, by your pastor. And this research is not published yet. It's currently in the process of being published. It's under review currently. But in this study, I looked at moral conflict in survivors of intimate partner sexual violence. And one of the questions that I asked these survivors was, what is your experience of moral conflict in your relationships? Like, how is that presented for you? And something that came up over and over again was survivors saying, I feel like I betrayed myself by not standing up for what I knew was right. So that really speaks to, there's this innate feeling and intuition, a conscience perhaps, that says the way this person is treating me is wrong. I know that it's wrong, but I love them. They're telling me they love me. And if there's outside messaging as well, like, oh, you have to stay with this person, you have to make it work with this person, then now there's this immense inner conflict between, I know the way that I'm being treated is wrong, but everyone else is telling me, or the world is telling me, or my partner is telling me that this relationship is right. And so what survivors talked about over and over again was saying, I feel like I betrayed myself because I didn't stand up for what I knew was right. I let myself, I don't want to say let myself, again, this is the words of the survivors, but I let myself continue to be treated this way. One woman said, I thought I would never let myself be treated like this, but here I am tolerating it, and I don't know what to do about it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the people that I worked with years ago shared her story publicly. She was a police officer and she was trained in domestic violence. And
Wow.
she started dating this guy. She said, he'll never get away with that with me because I've been specially trained and he knows it. And sure enough, she was abused in every possible way, psychologically, physically, sexually. And it took her a long time to get out. She also had all these other messages going on that caused her to stay. This also brings up another point. I find that a lot of people won't leave for their own protection, but when the violence gets to a certain level with their children,
Mm-hmm.
then they'll leave. I think part of it is it's easier to explain to other people,
Mm-hmm.
I left for the children. It sounds so much more defensible,
Understandable. Yes.
understandable.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yes.
And looking back, I kind of would put myself in that category. We didn't think that we were worth protecting, we ourselves. It had to go to the
Yeah.
children too, before we valued even ourselves. Oh, that's a little painful to think about.
And I was just about to mention that I think it's because, unfortunately, with survivors of abuse, a lot of times their self-worth and their self-respect has been torn down so much that they don't believe that they're worth leaving for. They don't believe that it's worth it for them to leave. A lot of times they start to think that they deserve what's happening to them. That's that self-blame coming in. This
Yeah.
is all my fault.
Going back to what you talked about at the very beginning of the interview,
mm,
it is especially powerful when people like me, and so many people in my group are like this, either they were going to church from the week they were born,
mm,
or their faith was devout, sincere, and genuine, and they were soaked in these teachings. A
mhm,
fish doesn't know it's wet.
mhm.
This is how we thought the world worked, and it's not our fault. This is what we were taught by every radio program, every Christian broadcast, every Christian author, every pastor, every guest pastor, every youth pastor. This is the same message we got from all of them. And so it's not our fault that we couldn't leave when it got to be destructive and that it took us a long time because we were marinated in these messages.
Absolutely. No, that makes absolute sense. And by the way, it's hard for non-religious people to leave too. The act of leaving a partner, the way that someone can break down your confidence and make you feel like you're worthless, can happen to anybody, regardless of what their religion is. But Research does find that if you are more religious, you are likely to stay longer in an abusive, violent relationship than people who are non-religious. And I think you're absolutely right. It probably comes down to those messages and those teachings that you hear when you're a little kid.
Absolutely. Yeah. I remember the first time I ever read that study that said that religious people stay longer and endure more damage. The light went on for me. Wow, even social scientists, even family researchers can see it. We as devout believers, as devout people of faith, we suffer more than anyone else. Somebody sees us. Somebody gives us credit for what we've been through. Now, we've been going for almost a full hour here,
I'm
and
not surprised.
we need to talk, unless you've got something more that you want to dig into in this area. I want to talk about what have you found that people can do if they say, yep, that's me. I have experienced so much moral injury. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
How do you find that people heal from this kind of trauma?
Unfortunately, it's very difficult. I wanted to
Thank you for saying that. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's really difficult. And there's no, unfortunately, quick fix. There's no unloading all of your trauma all at once and then you're healed. Unfortunately, the trauma took many, many years to form. It's probably going to take many years to heal. And I wanted to share something that Jonathan Shea said in his book, Achilles in Vietnam, which, by the way, is a great read. So even though it's about military context, I think that survivors could see a lot of themselves in the stories that are shared. And it's a really accessible book. So it's written for the masses. It's not too academic. So I actually think it's a great read for people. Jonathan Shea said in this book that clinicians and everyone needs to remember that healing is done by survivors, not to survivors. And I love that quote because often what you find with survivors of abuse is that so much agency has been taken from them. And that idea gives you some agency back. You are the one in control of your healing. You are capable of doing the healing. And so again, it's unfortunately very difficult. I will start with maybe talking a little bit about therapy. I will share some other options and ideas as well, because I know that there are limitations with therapy. For example, it's expensive, so people it might not be financially feasible for a lot of people, and there might just be lots of things going on for people. So a note with therapy, just as we would not go to a cardiologist if we're having a problem with our foot, there are lots of different types of mental health professionals. And I think we don't think of it in that way, but realistically, there are so many different types of traumas, of issues that people can have. For example, substance abuse disorder, childhood abuse. People might have that, I can't recall it at the moment, but the condition where you can't leave your house. So different therapists will have different specializations, different interests based on who they are. And so what I would say is if you are interested in potentially starting therapy and seeing a therapist, what you want to look for are the keywords trauma informed. You want to look for trauma informed, because that is going to be someone, who has interest and expertise in treating people probably with PTSD, with depression from experiences of complex trauma. And I want to say, as a survivor of intimate partner violence, you very likely have experienced complex trauma, because you very likely experienced different types of traumatic experiences over very long periods of time. So people find, this is one reason, by the way, why women have higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than do men. And one of the reasons is because even though men and women experience traumas, men are more likely to experience what's called low betrayal traumas, meaning car accidents, hurricanes, natural weather events. But women are much more likely to experience high betrayal traumas where they're either abused by a parent or by a partner. And so that's one of the reasons why there are differences there. So that's what I would say if you are looking for a therapist, and I do recommend therapy, I would say look for someone who's trauma informed. Now, ideally, research does find that if the therapist can integrate your spirituality, your religious beliefs into the therapy, then the results are more efficacious. It just works better if someone is able to integrate your religious beliefs into the therapy. But I think the most important thing here is the trauma informed, because unfortunately, I think if you look only for a Christian counselor, you are risking that they may not be knowledgeable about trauma, and that you might receive some sort of victim blaming attitudes like you maybe get from other religious people. So that's my concern with going just to a Christian counselor who's not also trauma informed in that way.
Yeah, not to mention that they may be on the staff of a church that doesn't condone divorce
Right.
for physical violence, verbal, emotional, psychological, or sexual abuse. That's just like slamming your head against the wall. You're not going
Right.
to get very far because they have a vested interest in keeping you trapped.
Absolutely.
And regardless whether they tell you to go or to get to safety or to leave, their goal in the end is always for you to reconcile and go back. So that is insidious. And they're secretive about it. They usually won't
Mhm.
tell you what they're going to do. So they end up betraying you on top of the betrayal you've already experienced. I want to say something about the expense of therapy. So for 30 years, I've run lay-led single moms groups and divorce recovery groups in my church.
Mm.
And none of us was a professional, not a single one of us. Obviously, there were some women who were hurting so much. They had been so destroyed that they weren't right for our group. But for the vast majority, this was a place that we could come, we could tell our story, we could tell what happened last week, we could cry, we could get angry, we could hug each other, we could sympathize, empathize, and it did amazing things. Many of us from that group 30 years ago are still friends today. And when I look back, I remember at the beginning thinking, I feel like I have a black cloud above my head and I will never be happy again. I feel like I am disqualified from ever serving God again. I feel that I will never be happy again. I feel that I will never find love again because my man picker is too broken. And what happened is developing these wonderful relationships with other women who are walking the same path. Some of them ahead of me, they'd been divorced years longer than I had, and they had a sparkle in their eye. And I thought, I want that sparkle. I want to know that there's life on the other side. I want to know that my children can turn out to be good friends, good people, good employees, good employers, good students, good neighbors. I want to know that they won't be damaged from this. And what we found is even though we didn't have the money for therapy, I mean, I had to often make the decision between a gallon of gas and a gallon of milk. So therapy wasn't even a possibility for people like me. But
Right.
having this group, we came to church, we did it as an alternative Sunday school class. So there was childcare because there was Sunday school going on for the adults elsewhere. And here, my conservative, very anti divorce church was happy to have a single moms group because we talked about getting up on our own 2 feet again. We talked about how to do job interviews. We redid our resumes with one another. We practiced doing interviews. We talked about discipline issues. We talked about forgiveness. We talked about our anger. And the church loved the results they were seeing. And the church could get involved with helping us repair our cars and do home repairs and things like that. And so, even though not a single one of us was a legit therapist, I mean, who knows? I'm sure I said horrible things in those early years, not really knowing, but people felt loved and they
Yeah.
always felt listened to because we allowed you to ramble for an hour if you had to about what had happened that week. And so I think there is a place for lay ministry, even if you do some wrong things, as long as you're there to be loving, encouraging, and supportive.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot there. First, I want to say that's so moving that your church allowed that and encouraged it and offered so much support. I can't imagine you see that very often. So that's incredible. What I would say too, and you took the words out of my mouth, this is the second thing I was going to bring up, is the power of community with other people and community with other survivors and doing exactly what you did. There's a proven therapy for moral injury that, again, has only been validated in military populations as of now. It's called adaptive disclosure. And it is conducted by a therapist, but it's a group therapy because one of the outcomes of moral injury is losing trust in other people and losing trust in yourself. And so it damages not only your relationships with the people who harmed you, but also with everyone else, because now you don't know who to trust, right? And I think what you're explaining here makes absolute sense for being an effective treatment for moral injury, because you're rebuilding trust in other people by being involved in a group like that. And you are allowing people to express anger, to express rage, to express that they feel betrayed by other people. So absolutely, this is what we see with Alcoholics Anonymous being effective. Sharing what has happened to you, sharing your feelings with other people is extremely effective. So again, if you can't afford therapy, and also even if you can afford therapy, being a part of a group like this, providing that there aren't harmful doctrines being put into the group, would absolutely be a great place to start.
If people are interested in a curriculum, I finally found a good Christian curriculum that I think could be used. I think it's also really important to call it a single mothers group, because these very conservative churches often don't want to call it a divorce recovery group, because to some judgmental people, that sounds like you're coddling divorcees and giving them room, space, and free childcare, and you're rewarding them for divorcing. So
Mm.
it's much better to call it a single mothers group where they can donate clothes, all kinds of things. And the church really sees the benefit of doing it. I can't believe how often I was allowed to speak in front of other groups about how the single moms group was doing and how women who had maybe been out of the workforce for a decade or two were finding jobs and earning money and developing self-respect again for the first time in years. And the church just glowed. They were so happy to hear these reports. And so they just continued putting us in the church bulletin and supporting our efforts. I mean, they didn't do anything for us financially necessarily, or not very much, but they were behind us and we felt their support, even though we did talk a lot about justified divorce, a life-saving divorce. We could still, as devout Christians, be against frivolous divorces, but that wasn't any of us. To have been through what we went through and to come on a Tuesday night and sit in a cold, hard plastic Sunday school chair and talk about what we had been through really is the kind of thing that only a person who's really been injured by what they've been through, and yet they really want to know, how do I reconcile this with my faith in God? Those are the kind of people who will venture out on a cold night and come to church just to talk about their experiences. So these have been wonderful years, and to see how our children have grown up, how we've gone on to amazing things. And it's really been a huge blessing to see. I sometimes say, when you've cried a million tears with someone else and when you've shared your story a million times, then the pain goes away. I only sense pain and betrayal from my own story, only 15 minutes a year. That's how long it's been, and that's how many times I've been able to share my story with others who've walked the same path. And that's the key. You can't share this story with people who haven't walked the path. If they haven't divorced or been through heinous betrayal themselves, then they won't ever get it, or they don't get it. And it's not because they don't care, or aren't empathetic, or aren't good people. It just, there's a special bond that happens with people who've been through this. Anyway, give us some closing thoughts, and then I want people to know where to find your study. And I want to know if there's any way that people can follow you. I don't know if you're on social media. I see you're on LinkedIn, but give us some ideas of where we can go from here.
Closing thoughts. I'll just say that I think you being in Gretchen's group is an enormous first start to recovery. So good on you for finding that resource and for taking advantage of it, because what we find from research very consistently is that community with others, especially community with others who have been through the same things as us, who believe the same things that we do, is so important for your recovery. And what I'd like to say perhaps to people who are maybe still in relationships that are extremely toxic, extremely abusive, is regardless of whether you believe it or not at this moment, you are worth leaving. You can respect yourself. You do have the power and the strength to leave and to be successful without this person. And regardless of how you feel, whether you blame yourself, whether you don't trust yourself anymore, there is recovery after this. Through community, through your relationship with your religion and your beliefs, there is a way past this. And I don't want to minimize the through, because going through that valley, that pit, where you have to make this really difficult decision it's going to be enormous. There's going to be pain, there's going to be suffering. But what I would like to say is that there's pain and suffering now. And on the other side is self-respect, joy, good, healthy relationships with other people, healthy, happy kids. And that life can be yours if you take that step and you do it.
Yeah.
I'd like to leave people with that.
Wonderful. Amen. And one more word about the children. Children need at least one home where there is peace and freedom from chaos, where they are loved and accepted. And so even if you share custody with the other parent, and I know a lot of people stay because they don't want that, the truth of the matter is you are that oasis 50% of the time, maybe not even 50% of the time, but your children need to see what a safe oasis is like, because there's something in their soul that just gravitates to peace and safety and a lack of chaos. 8 in 10 kids of divorce come out just fine. How can people follow you? How can people get your study, your new study?
Absolutely. So I'll briefly explain the publishing process, which is that unfortunately, as authors, our research gets published in these different journals, and we don't have access to say, like, oh, everyone can just get this article, for example. So the publisher retains the rights. And unfortunately, they often charge $30, $40 for these articles. I don't want you to pay $30 or $40 for my article. So there are two options. I have a website. It's rachellkanter.com. And you can email me there and request the article. Basically, the rules of this publisher are that if you ask me to give you the article, I can send you the article, no problem, but I can't publish it anywhere because that would transgress their rights to the article. So if you email me and request the article, I'm more than happy to give it to you. So that's
Would
one
you
option.
spell your name?
Rachel, the letter L, and then my last name, Kanter, Kanter.com.
Great.
Another option, and this might be a great option if you're generally interested in getting access to different articles as well, is there's a website called researchgate.net, and anyone can make an account. It's free. And you can use that to contact individual researchers and request their articles as well. And so if you're interested in maybe reading anyone else's research, that might be a good option for you as well.
Great. And you're on there so they could contact you. And I know on ResearchGate, there's a button that says request full text or something like that. You click the button, then you click another button and it goes to you or to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'll explain that process really quick. If you just Google my name and ResearchGate, my profile will come up in the search engine. It's easy peasy. You can click a blue button that says request full text to a specific article that I have. That comes directly to me. I'll approve it and send it right to you.
Well, thank you so much for all your time. I can tell you really understand this topic, and I just love how you've responded to all these questions and you really get it. Not everybody does. And so I
No.
really appreciate your time, Rachel. And, you're at the beginning of your publishing career and you're in the middle of your education, but I really think you're going to move mountains and you're going to make a big difference in this world. So you go, girl.
Well, thank you very much. I hope to. There are a lot of people out there who are just really suffering and we don't have enough resources for them. So hopefully we make a difference.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Gretchen.
If you benefited from this recording, you will find support and clarity in my book, The Life-Saving Divorce, available in paperback or Kindle or audiobook on Amazon. You can also follow me, Gretchen Baskerville, online at lifesavingdivorce.com or on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. You can sign up for my email list at lifesavingdivorce.com. Women and men of faith may request to join my private online Facebook group, Life Saving Divorce Private Group. For more on life-saving divorces, please subscribe and click the link to the next recording.